March 10, 2019, a Boeing 737 MAX climbed into the morning sky above Ethiopia. On board were 157 people from more than 30 countries: students, doctors, engineers, parents, aid workers. For a few moments, it looked like an ordinary flight. Then the pilots made an urgent radio call. They wanted to turn back immediately. Just 6 minutes later, the airplane crashed. Nobody survived. The tragedy shocked the world. But investigators quickly discovered something even more disturbing. This wasn't the first time. Just 5 months earlier, another Boeing 737 MAX had crashed into the Java Sea near Indonesia. That crash killed 189 people. Different airline, different crew, different country. Yet the early evidence looked almost identical. And suddenly a terrifying question emerged. How could the newest aircraft from one of the world's most respected companies crash twice in nearly the same way? At first, people searched for simple answers. Maybe it was pilot error. Maybe it was maintenance. Maybe it was weather. But as investigators examined the wreckage, those explanations started falling apart. Something much larger was hiding beneath the surface. The consequences appeared immediately. Families lost loved ones. Passengers canceled trips. Airlines questioned their fleets. Investors watched billions of dollars disappear. For decades, Boeing had been a symbol of engineering excellence. Now its name was appearing beside words like disaster, investigation, and failure. Trust was beginning to collapse. And trust is far harder to rebuild than an airplane. Then investigators noticed a strange pattern. In both crashes, the aircraft repeatedly pushed its nose downward. The pilots fought to pull it back up, again and again and again. It looked almost as if the airplane was arguing with the people flying it. Modern aviation is built on the idea that pilots control aircraft. So why did this airplane seem determined to do something else? The answer would eventually lead investigators to a hidden software system. A system most passengers had never heard of. A system many investors had never heard of. And a system that became one of the most controversial pieces of software in aviation history. Its name was MCAS. But MCAS wasn't where the story started. To understand that, we have to follow the money. Because this wasn't only an aviation disaster. It was also a business story. A story about competition. A story about deadlines. A story about market share. And a story about billions of dollars. The kind of money that can influence entire industries. The kind of money that can pressure companies into making decisions faster than they should. What makes this story so powerful is that nobody woke up one morning trying to build a dangerous airplane. Most corporate disasters don't begin with evil intentions. They begin with pressure. One deadline, one competitor, one shortcut, one decision, then another, until the consequences become impossible to ignore. By the time the crisis ended, 346 people were dead. Boeing had lost tens of billions of dollars. Executives faced investigations. Governments launched inquiries. And one of the most successful aircraft programs in history became a case study in business schools around the world. But none of that had happened yet. The real story began years earlier, when a rival company made a move that terrified Boeing. And that rival was Airbus. To understand the Boeing 737 MAX crisis, we need to go back to 2010. At the time, Boeing wasn't dealing with crashes. It wasn't dealing with investigations. It wasn't dealing with lawsuits. Instead, it was dealing with something that terrified every public company, a competitor that was winning. And that competitor was Airbus. For years, Boeing and Airbus had dominated commercial aviation. Together, they controlled most of the global airliner market. But the balance was beginning to shift. In December 2010, Airbus announced the A320neo. To most passengers, it looked like just another airplane. To airlines, it looked like a financial opportunity. The aircraft promised significantly lower fuel consumption than older models. That mattered because fuel is one of the largest costs in aviation. A small improvement in efficiency could save an airline hundreds of millions of dollars over time. Airline executives noticed immediately, and so did Boeing. Orders started arriving fast. Airlines around the world rushed to secure the new aircraft. Within months, Airbus had accumulated thousands of commitments and orders. The numbers were shocking. Each order represented future revenue, future relationships, future market share. Every contract Airbus won was money Boeing might never see, and investors were watching closely. Then came a moment that changed everything. American Airlines, one of Boeing's most important customers, was considering a major aircraft purchase. For decades, American had been heavily associated with Boeing. Inside Boeing headquarters, executives expected to keep that relationship strong. Instead, Airbus suddenly became a serious contender. The possibility of losing such a customer created panic, because this wasn't just one sale. fail, it was a signal to the entire industry. The stakes were enormous. The Boeing 737 family had generated billions of dollars over decades. It was one of the most successful commercial aircraft programs ever created. Losing ground to Airbus could affect revenue for years, perhaps decades. Wall Street analysts understood the risk. Investors understood the risk. Executives understood the risk. The pressure inside Boeing was growing rapidly, and pressure changes how people make decisions. Now Boeing faced a crossroads. Option 1. Design an entirely new aircraft. That would be expensive. It could cost billions of dollars, and it could take close to a decade. Option 2. Modify the existing 737. That would be faster, cheaper, and more attractive to customers who already operated Boeing aircraft. The decision looked obvious, at least at the time. From a business perspective, upgrading the existing aircraft seemed brilliant. Airlines already owned 737s. Pilots already knew how to fly them. Maintenance crews already knew how to repair them. Factories already knew how to build them. Why start from scratch? Why spend years developing something completely new while Airbus kept winning orders? Boeing chose speed, and that decision would eventually shape everything that followed. The upgraded aircraft became the Boeing 737 MAX. Customers responded quickly. Orders poured in. Thousands of aircraft were eventually sold. For a moment, Boeing appeared to have solved its problem. Investors relaxed. Executives celebrated. The company looked ready to stop Airbus's momentum. But hidden beneath that apparent victory was a technical challenge that very few people outside Boeing understood. And solving that challenge would lead to one of the most controversial decisions in aviation history. The solution was a software system called MCAS. The Boeing 737 MAX looked similar to older 737 aircraft. That similarity was important. Boeing wanted airlines to move to the MAX as easily as possible. The easier the transition, the easier it would be to sell aircraft. But beneath the surface, the MAX was different. Its larger engines improved fuel efficiency. They helped Boeing compete with Airbus. However, those larger engines created a new engineering challenge, and that challenge forced Boeing to make another critical decision. The new engines were bigger than previous 737 engines. Because of the aircraft's design, engineers had to place them differently. That change slightly altered how the aircraft behaved in certain situations. Most passengers would never notice. Most pilots might never notice. But Boeing's engineers certainly noticed. The company now had a problem. Not a catastrophic problem, but a problem that needed a solution. And quickly. Remember the pressure Boeing was facing. Airbus was collecting orders. Customers wanted answers. Investors wanted growth. Delays meant money. Every month mattered. Every sale mattered. Every customer mattered. The company needed a solution that was effective, affordable, and fast. Eventually, engineers developed a software system designed to help manage the aircraft's behavior. That system became known as MCAS. MCAS stood for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. The name sounded technical, but its purpose was relatively simple. Under specific conditions, if the aircraft appeared to approach a dangerous angle, MCAS could automatically push the nose downward. In theory, it was helping pilots. In theory, it was improving safety. And because it operated mostly in the background, few people outside Boeing paid much attention to it. At first glance, MCAS seemed like a clever solution. No major redesign, no expensive delays, no completely new aircraft. The MAX could remain competitive against Airbus. Customers could continue receiving deliveries. Investors could continue seeing growth. From a business perspective, it looked efficient. But aviation history is filled with systems that worked perfectly in theory and very differently in reality. One of the most important details involved data. MCAS relied heavily on information coming from an angle of attack sensor. That sensor helps determine how the aircraft is moving through the air. Normally, this information is extremely useful. The problem appears when the sensor sends incorrect data because computers don't know when information is wrong. They simply react to what they receive. And that created a hidden vulnerability. Imagine a smoke alarm that suddenly believes your kitchen is on fire when nothing is burning. The alarm doesn't know it's wrong. It simply reacts. Investigators would later discover that a similar problem could occur with MCAS. If incorrect sensor data entered the system, the software could respond to a danger that didn't actually exist. The software believed it was helping. The pilots believed something was wrong, and that difference would become critically important. At the time, however, the Boeing 737 MAX appeared to be a massive success. Orders continued continued growing. Airlines remained interested. Investors were optimistic. The aircraft looked like proof that Boeing had successfully responded to Airbus. But hidden beneath those strong sales numbers were small warning signs. Pilot reports, unexpected alerts, minor incidents. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines. Not yet. Most companies face warning signs before a crisis. The challenge is recognizing them. Sometimes those signs appear as complaints. Sometimes they appear as unusual data. Sometimes they appear as isolated incidents that seem unrelated. The Boeing 737 MAX was beginning to generate those signs. Few people understood what they meant, and fewer people understood how serious they might become. Then one flight experienced a strange series of problems. The crew managed to land safely. Passengers walked away. The airplane survived. Most people forgot about it almost immediately, but investigators later discovered that this flight contained one of the most important clues in the entire story. Because less than 24 hours later, the same aircraft would take off again, and this time, 189 people would never return home. On October 28, 2018, a Boeing 737 MAX operated by Lion Air departed from Bali, Indonesia. Shortly after takeoff, the crew began receiving confusing warnings. Flight instruments disagreed with each other. Alerts appeared unexpectedly. The aircraft behaved in ways that didn't make sense. Inside the cockpit, pilots worked through checklists and procedures. Passengers had no idea anything unusual was happening, but the crew knew something was wrong. The question was, what? For several stressful minutes, the pilots fought to understand the problem. Then something remarkable happened. An off-duty pilot riding in the cockpit jump seat suggested a procedure that helped stabilize the situation. The crew followed the advice. The aircraft landed safely in Jakarta. Everyone survived. To most people, it looked like a routine technical incident. But in reality, Boeing had just received a warning that would soon become impossible to ignore. After landing, maintenance teams inspected the aircraft. Work was performed. Records were updated. The airplane was cleared to fly again. At the time, that decision didn't seem unusual. Commercial aircraft experience maintenance issues every day. Most are fixed without incident. But history would later view this moment very differently. Because the danger had not disappeared. It was simply waiting for the next flight. The following morning, October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 prepared for departure. On board were 189 people, families, workers, students, children, crew members. Like every passenger, they trusted the aircraft, they trusted the airline, and they trusted the systems designed to keep them safe. Within minutes of takeoff, that trust would be tested. Almost immediately, the pilots began facing problems similar to those from the previous day. Warnings appeared. Flight instruments disagreed. The aircraft's nose started moving downward unexpectedly. The crew corrected. Then it happened again. They corrected again. The pattern repeated. Inside the cockpit, confusion was growing, and every repetition increased the danger. What the pilots didn't know was that MCAS believed the aircraft was approaching a stall. The software was reacting to faulty sensor information. To MCAS, the threat looked real. To the pilots, the aircraft's behavior seemed irrational. Both sides were responding to different versions of reality. The software was trying to protect the airplane. The pilots were trying to protect the airplane, and they were fighting each other. For more than 10 minutes, the battle continued. The pilots repeatedly pulled the aircraft upward. MCAS repeatedly pushed it downward. Investigators later found evidence showing this struggle again and again in the flight data. Every correction was followed by another response. Every response created more confusion. Time was running out, and the crew was rapidly losing altitude. Then came the final moments. Lion Air Flight 610 plunged into the Java Sea. All 189 people on board were killed. The tragedy shocked Indonesia. Families demanded answers. Investigators rushed to recover evidence. But at that moment, very few people around the world realized what had happened. Most believed it was a single accident, a terrible accident, nothing more. As investigators analyzed the flight recorder, they discovered something unusual. The data repeatedly showed nose-down commands. Again and again and again. The pattern pointed toward a system few people had discussed publicly. MCAS. Suddenly, investigators had a lead. A software system hidden deep inside a modern airliner was becoming the center of attention. But proving its role would take time. Meanwhile, Boeing 737 MAX aircraft continued flying around the world. Passengers kept boarding. Airlines kept operating flights. Orders kept arriving. Investors remained focused on growth. The business machine continued moving. Yet beneath the surface, investigators were uncovering evidence that suggested Lion Lion Air was not just an isolated tragedy. And 5 months later, a second crash would turn suspicion into a global crisis because another Boeing 737 MAX was about to fall from the sky. March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 departed Addis Ababa. On board were 157 passengers and crew from more than 30 countries. Unlike Lion Air, this crash happened while investigators were already examining a Boeing 737 MAX disaster. Questions already existed. Concerns already existed. Warning signs already existed. What nobody expected was how quickly another tragedy would occur. Within minutes, the flight was in serious trouble. Shortly after takeoff, the pilots contacted air traffic control. They requested permission to return to the airport. That request immediately caught attention. Commercial pilots do not ask to turn around minutes after departure without a serious reason. Something was happening inside the cockpit. The crew understood it. The controllers understood it. But nobody yet understood how closely this flight resembled Lion Air 610. The aircraft began behaving strangely. The nose moved downward. The pilots corrected. Then it happened again. The crew corrected again. As investigators later reconstructed the flight, they discovered a pattern that looked disturbingly familiar. Different airline, different pilots, different continent. Yet many of the same symptoms were appearing once more. And that similarity would change everything. Just 6 minutes after takeoff, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed. All 157 people on board died. Now the total death toll linked to the Boeing 737 MAX had reached 346. The impact was immediate. After Lion Air, many people viewed the crash as a tragedy. After Ethiopian Airlines, people began asking whether there was a systemic problem. The conversation changed overnight. Around the world, confidence collapsed. Passengers became nervous. Pilots became concerned. Airlines demanded answers. Investors watched events unfold in disbelief. Because 2 crashes involving this same new aircraft model in less than 5 months was almost impossible to ignore. The pressure on Boeing exploded. The pressure on regulators exploded. And the pressure on investigators exploded. Then governments started taking action. China moved first. Other countries followed. One aviation authority after another grounded the Boeing 737 MAX. Aircraft that had been flying passengers just days earlier were suddenly parked. Hundreds of airplanes sat idle. Thousands of flights were disrupted. The grounding spread across the world. The industry was sending a message. Something was seriously wrong. For Boeing, the financial consequences were brutal. Aircraft deliveries slowed. Customers demanded explanations. Future orders became uncertain. The company's stock price dropped sharply. Billions of dollars in market value disappeared. Every grounded aircraft represented lost revenue. Every delayed delivery represented lost cash flow. Every day the crisis continued. The financial damage grew larger. But investigators were focused on something even more important. Why had 2 nearly identical disasters happened? The answer couldn't simply be bad luck. The odds were too small. The similarities were too strong. The evidence was pointing toward a common cause. Now investigators had flight data from 2 crashes, and the deeper they looked, the more they kept finding the same name, MCAS. At the same time, another uncomfortable question emerged. Had there been warnings before the crashes? Pilot reports existed. Technical concerns existed. Questions about training existed. Questions about certification existed. Some clues had been visible. Some concerns had been documented. Now investigators wanted to know who saw those warnings and what happened next. The investigation was moving beyond engineering. It was moving toward decision-making. The crashes had exposed the disaster, but they had not yet explained it. To find the real answer, investigators would need emails, internal documents, certification records, executive decisions, and evidence stretching back years. Because this was no longer just a story about a software system. It was becoming a story about corporate pressure, competition, and accountability. And what investigators discovered inside Boeing would make the crisis even bigger. After the second crash, investigators stopped looking only at airplanes. Now they were looking at Boeing itself. Congress launched hearings. Regulators opened investigations. Journalists requested documents. Victims' families demanded answers. The question was no longer, what happened? Now it was, how is this allowed to happen? And that question threatened Boeing far more than any technical failure. As investigators examined internal records, they discovered a company operating under enormous competitive pressure. Airbus had changed the market. Customers wanted fuel-efficient aircraft. Investors wanted growth. Executives wanted results. Every delay risked losing billions in future orders. None of this proved wrongdoing, but it helped explain the environment in which critical decisions had been made, and that environment became a major focus of the investigation. Attention quickly turned towards certification. How had the aircraft been approved? How much information had regulators received? Were all risks fully understood? Were all concerns properly communicated? These questions became central because certification is supposed to be the final safety barrier. If that barrier fails, problems can reach passengers. And now investigators were trying to understand whether that barrier had worked as intended. Internal communications added even more pressure to the story. Emails, messages, and documents revealed debates inside the company. Employees discussed schedules, training requirements, certification challenges, business pressures. Taken individually, many of these documents looked ordinary. Taken together, they painted a picture of a company trying to balance safety, competition, cost, and speed at the same time. And that balance can be dangerous. Meanwhile, the financial damage kept growing. Production slowed, delivery stopped. Airlines demanded compensation. Legal costs increased. The grounding stretched from months into years of consequences. Eventually, the total financial impact reached tens of billions of dollars. Enough money to build airports. Enough money to fund major public projects. Enough money to change the future of entire companies. Leadership changes followed. CEO Dennis Muhlenberg became one of the most visible figures in the crisis. For years, he had helped lead one of America's most important manufacturers. Now he faced lawmakers, regulators, journalists, investors, and victims' families. The pressure became enormous. Eventually, he left the company. For many observers, that moment symbolized how deeply the crisis had reached into Boeing's leadership. The 737 MAX eventually returned to service after software changes, additional reviews, and updated pilot training requirements. Millions of passengers have since flown safely on the aircraft. Airlines continue operating it around the world. The airplane survived. The company survived. But survival is not the same as trust. And trust was the thing Boeing had lost the most. What makes this story so important is that there was no single movie-style villain. Most people involved believed they were solving problems. Engineers wanted solutions. Executives wanted competitiveness. Airlines wanted efficiency. Investors wanted growth. Yet history repeatedly shows that good intentions do not automatically create good outcomes, especially when deadlines and billions of dollars are involved. In the end, the Boeing 737 MAX crisis became more than an aviation story. It became a business lesson, a lesson about incentives, a lesson about pressure, a lesson about risk, and a lesson about what can happen when small decisions slowly build into a much larger problem. Because major corporate disasters rarely arrive all at once. They arrive one decision at a time. Today, Boeing continues competing with Airbus. The 737 MAX continues flying. The aviation industry continues moving forward, but the memory of those 346 victims remains. And so does the question their story leaves behind. When billions of dollars are on the line, how can any company be sure that speed, profit, and competition never become more important than safety?